Okay, welcome. We're here to talk about steampunk. Great. Looks like we got some fans in the audience. Okay, so we are going to go down the table and introduce ourselves. But first, I'm always impressed that you have come to an hour with us. That means that you read the program and this is a subject that interests you. So we want to make sure we're covering what you came here for. That means I'm going to ask you what you want to get out of this hour, what you're hoping to hear from us, and any questions that you have right off the bat so that we cover them in our discussion, okay? So start thinking about that while we go down the table. John, let's start with you.
John Olsen. I have several published short stories and one novel. The short stories are where I've branched out into steampunk. You can usually find me all dressed up at things like Salt Lake Comic Convention now. It's been renamed.
That's right. That's right. Be careful.
It's a lot of fun to get into both the storytelling aspects and the costuming. That's one of the things that really draws me to steampunk.
Also, his wife's name is in all of your bags. So he's famous.
Yeah, my wife is the sponsor
Yeah.
for the swag stuff.
He's Mr. Kelly Olsen.
You laugh.
Hi, I'm Jess Lindsay Fowler. I'm primarily on this panel as a fan. I love steampunk, and I didn't know what it was when I was introduced to it, so it's been a fun journey. I use it in my writing. I'm not published yet, still working on that. So, yeah.
My name is Scott Tarbet. I'm a real Scot, unlike this guy. I'm most recognizable in Utah for my hat. I'm the author of a number of novels and novellas in the Midsummer Night's Steampunk universe.
Awesome. So I am the not real Scott. I write middle grade fantasy. I started with the Far World series, and then the Case File 13 series, and then my newest series that just finished is the Mysteries of Cove series, which is a steampunk dragon middle grade series.
And it's a lot of fun.
My name is Jennifer. No, I'm just kidding. I write as J. Scott Savage. My first name is Jeff, but there's a Jeff Savage who writes a lot of kids' sports books. So when I go to conferences and mention Jeff, a lot of times I get introduced and I'm like, that is a great bio. That is not my bio. So I am the other Jeff Savage, which is why I have to be the other Scott Savage. There we go.
We've got a great panel. These are a great bunch of writers and Uber fans. This is perfect. Okay, so you've been thinking. Tell us what you want to hear from us this hour. What have you got? Yes, in front.
It's like a newer genre, so are there any like hard and fast rules of what you can do with steampunk? Like I know you have a lot of the clockwork stuff and all that kind of stuff, but are there some like big no-nos?
That's great. Rules and punk in the same sentence. Jay.
How do you sell and market steampunk?
Good. Jenny.
How do you write steampunk without being too heavy-handed?
Good.
Good one.
In the very back.
Making believable steampunk setting and characters.
Okay. Yes.
Steampunk often seems very brown, and I get the aspect from a steam-centered technology standpoint, but even then, color was imbued. How do you deal with that?
The visual aspects in a non-visual medium. Very good. Yes?
The difference, I can't even remember the term, the difference between steampunk and gaslamp.
Gaslight. Okay. Yes.
Common cliches of steampunk and how to avoid them.
Okay, good. Oh, look, you've got them. Red. Go ahead.
Okay, so steampunk, is it actually a genre or is it more of a subgenre, and then what can you do to play around with that in that aspect? And what's the difference? Well, and I noticed a difference between more American writers and what they do in steampunk versus like say English writers and what they do. It seems like it's almost two different realms of the same ideas and how it's presented. So what's the differences that you guys noticed?
Okay. Great. Yes, sir.
maybe along with the cliches, what are the tropes, or what are people expecting and hoping for in steampunk?
Because the tropes and cliches really go together.
But expectations, because you don't want to say you have a steampunk novel and then there's nothing steampunk in it, right? Yes, I'm here.
How to start writing it when you've never done anything like it before?
Good.
What are some good ways to research for a steampunk novel?
Good. One more? No, that's everybody's questions. Okay, one more.
Yes. Just what defines like steampunk itself?
Let's do that first.
Yes, that's where we will start.
What is Wikipedia?
Great way to get us going. Let's define this baby. Steampunk, how would you define it in your own words? Anybody jump in? We're not going to go down the row or anything.
I actually just watched a documentary that gave the perfect definition in one phrase. It is 19th century sci-fi.
Cool. I like it.
Yeah, it's how people in that age would perceive their far future to be. And so it's all the technologies that they think might have happened based on the limited technologies they had at the time. So it does tie into that.
I'll speak from somebody who was born in the middle of the 20th century. The 20th century is the most god-awful, horrible century in the history of mankind, bar none. And if you strip it away, and strip away all the garbage that came with it, and take us back to a simpler time when technology was our friend instead of our end-the-world enemy, then you have steampunk.
That's a cool way to put it. I like that. What if we took the etymology of it? Because oh, by the way, I didn't introduce myself because I assume you all know who I am.
Of course.
I'm an editor. My name is Callie Stoker, and I own and run the Manuscript Doctrine. We're a developmental editing group. Okay, so if we took the etymology of steampunk, what do those words mean, and how does that show what we are creating in steampunk?
Punk has been through several iterations where the really biggest one came out, I think, generally with cyberpunk. And so it's kind of an add-on to say, we're taking the first part of that and we're twisting it and doing some funny things with it.
Good. Punking is to twist it and do funny things. Anyone else want to say what punk is?
No, that's good.
Well, I'll say what steam is.
Okay.
If you strip away all of those technologies that defined the 20th century, the electricity, the computers, the nuclear annihilation threat, and you go back before that, steam power was the cutting edge. It was the bleeding edge of technology, and it was what made people so hopeful when you could cross the continent, the North American continent in 3 days. That was miraculous, and it was steam.
Cool. And so it's making steam cool again, which is what I love about steampunk, and helping us see it in a way that isn't old-fashioned, but is new and shiny and fun.
And tying into that era again, I mean, obviously we focus a ton on the technology, but then we look at steampunk attire and all the things that go with it, which really, again, tie back to a certain time period, and then you twist that and play with it as well, and combine attire with technology too.
So, and that, if I can drag us off to the side just a little tiny bit, that's the answer to the difference between steampunk and gas lamp.
Right.
Steampunk is gas lamp where technology drives the story.
Good. And go ahead and define gas lamp for those who might not.
Gas lamp is anything written as if it were in the Victorian era. So it shares the costuming, it shares some of the same tropes, but it is not technologically driven, which is what makes steampunk science fiction.
Okay, so someone asked, is this a genre in of itself or a subgenre, and has it shifted in the past 10 years?
Well, I think anytime, first of all, it's both, because it has subgenres underneath it, you know, and it is part of genres above it. And if you get really, you could get really, really narrow and say, well, gosh, there's only like 4 genres or 3 genres, and play with it. But I do think, in my mind, it has become a genre. When I can go to elementary schools and have slides of my covers start going up, and have elementary school kids go, oh, that's a steampunk dragon. In my mind at that point, it has become a genre. The knowledge is that widespread.
I agree.
I've actually had a lot of arguments with my husband about whether something is steampunk or diesel punk. And we've been like trying to narrow down exactly what time periods they are without looking it up ourselves, just based on what these stories contain. And it's really fascinating just how many subgenres have been sprouting up. I've seen Gaslamp that has become steampunk. I've seen like stuff that I thought was steampunk, but apparently isn't. And it's really interesting how it's just sort of evolved into this massive tree at this point.
Well, that's kind of an interesting grouping, because with steampunk, it's been the genre that's very welcoming of these other odd things that kind of can group together, because that's what it is at its heart, is a welcoming of new ideas. And so there really isn't a way of saying steampunk is only this little area here, because every time somebody says, well, here's something that's kind of close and something else that's kind of close, it just broadens out. And so it's really hard to say what the limits are with steampunk. It's more easy to just say, well, yeah, this has the flavor.
Yeah.
So let's go. Did you want to say
No,
something?
I was just going to say that you hear that a lot. I mean, my book, my Mysteries of Cove series, could definitely be described as middle grade dystopian. It can be described as dragon fantasy, but it's probably most focused. People are like, oh, this is a steampunk novel in a dystopian world, or a steampunk novel with dragons or stuff like that. So I think you're exactly right, that sometimes people come back and go, well, it's this, but it really has the flavor of this too, you know.
There's steampunk dystopian, there's historical or alternate history with a steampunk twist, and there are alternate universes where everything's steam powered. The common denominator is steam. Then there's the music, there's the costumes, there's the movies, movies that you might have seen that you didn't even realize were steampunk. Wild Wild West, the last one, 100% steampunk. Steampunk isn't any one of these things all by itself. Steampunk is an aesthetic.
That's great. So the question was, if you were to give rules to steampunk, and we've just talked about how open of a genre it is, but are there some actual have-tos, or it's not steampunk, or have to address, or it doesn't have the theme of steampunk?
I think it's more that you need to pick some of the elements, but you can have one story that picks these two, another story that picks another two, and so there isn't any one thing that you really have to have. But sometimes it feels like, oh yeah, you can throw gears and goggles on that and you're good. But there's really a lot more to it than that, because in the story writing, it goes down to relying somehow on that technology that differentiates it from, yeah, we're kind of trying to, yeah, we're really doing it in a way that means something.
One of I mean, I get negative reviews, obviously, but one of the national reviews that came back that wasn't as good of a review for Mysteries of Cove was a reader who said, you know, I wish this author wouldn't have spent so much time on the machinery. And it's like, that's
kind of the point.
Exactly. But it's actually become fun now because you've got STEM and STEAM so much in all of the schools that I didn't even know what STEM was until I started touring for Mysteries of Cove, and all these are like, oh, we've got these maker spaces and everything. This is a really great thing. And so I think that's actually had an uplifting effect, a growing effect. When I first published Mysteries of Cove, I had my Harper turned it down because they said, we don't think that steampunk will do well in middle grade. Well, since that, I mean, that was not even 3 years ago, and there have been a ton of middle grade steampunk novels that have come out since then. So it's nice to see that growth and resurgence.
Poor publishers.
I know, right?
They have to roll the dice and guess what's going to be hot next.
That's right.
And they miss it all the time.
Exactly.
Who's this, J.K. Rowling?
Yeah, right.
Something that I think is it's kind of a loose, very nebulous definition of what defines steampunk. It has to have imagination and innovation, because the beginnings of steampunk were like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells writing these fantastical stories taking place in these weird time periods, like The Time Machine, and we'll talk about Around the World in 80 Days, and we'll talk about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And they were looking at the innovations and using their imaginations in combination with what was available in these time periods that they were writing in.
Great, so I'm hearing that the aesthetics are an important part of steampunk, but you also need to cover some of the underlying themes and topics of steampunk, being the innovation, the ideas, which is why your book, Jeff, is so great, because it's a steampunk novel about how they don't want you to make any more ideas.
That was a
And
really
the
hard
kids are
thing in
pushing
that
against-
first book, yeah, is how do you write a steampunk novel in a world where creativity is against the
Yeah.
law? And once I got out into book 2, where I didn't have those limitations, it's like, cool, now we can do all these great inventions I wanted to do, you know, so yeah, but it was, I think innovation and creativity, my publisher would say all the time as we were going through the series, steampunk this up, you know, steampunk this scene up. And I'll say that to fantasy writers as well. If you read a fantasy, you want to see cool creatures and amazing magic and world building. I mean, that's what you read it for. And when you read steampunk, you want, how can I make this cooler? How can I make this more creative and innovative? And that's the thing that I think makes us as steampunk readers go, oh wow, I really love this story. I mean, you still have to have a strong story, but those in world building, that's key.
Yeah, there's one thing that I've had conversations on before with steampunk, where originally it seemed like it was kind of a dark view of a very mechanical world, but the people that started doing the costuming and writing the stories decided, no, we're not going to do that, which is a very steampunk kind of attitude, and said, we're going to make this a celebration of what humanity can do in this arena.
And that's the division between cyberpunk and steampunk. Cyberpunk is very dark. Steampunk is hopeful.
Yes.
It's optimistic.
Does cyberpunk use like the same gears and stuff?
No.
Like, okay.
That's a much more technological, futuristic.
Right.
We'll take some more questions at the end, okay? So let's move into the how to do this. So if the expectation is to create this sense of wonder, themes of imagination and new ideas, how do we capture that on the page? How have you gone about it in your own stories?
One thing I ended up doing, I really like making the story rely upon the technology. Otherwise, you could rewrite it as a Western or a science fiction story or whatever. If you're actually putting that technology in as part of the story, for example, the story I have in here is effectively a steampunk Iron Man. And so the suit plays a very prominent part in this story. It's just a mechanical suit the guy wears and walks around and fights crime. Without the suit, there is no story. And I take advantage of a lot of the aesthetics as well, where I'm talking about the airships that they use, and like instead of bridges and boats going over the Thames in London, they've got a little airship on cords that they go back and forth. So there are these little bits and pieces that you can flavor it with, but then if you get just to the core story, it really does work better if it relies somehow on that technology.
Yeah, you can't just rely on it. It's got to spring from it. For instance, in this one is a steampunk treatment of the Shakespeare play A Midsummer Night's Dream. And it grew from the genesis of reading the Shakespeare play and them saying this group of bumpkins, they call them, Shakespeare calls them rude mechanicals. And so I thought, they could really be mechanical. Right? So these guys in this book are veterans who've been refitted with prostheses that are clockwork. And the rest of the story just flowed right out of that.
It's great. So it's not just the aesthetic, it's actually integral to the story. So if you took it out, the story would fall apart.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
you can write without that, but in any genre it's going to be more powerful if you use that. Like a fantasy story, why is it fantasy? Because you're going to rely upon the magic. It's the same thing with steampunk. You have to somehow rely upon it for it to be a more powerful story.
The definition, the very definition of science fiction is story driven by technology. The story has to be driven by technology, just not just a clock on the wall. The technology has to drive the story, and the same is very, very true of this genre of science fiction. The technology has to drive.
So let's address some of the pitfalls. Someone asked, when does it become too heavy-handed? When have you tipped the scale and disgusted everyone?
So I think in a lot of respects, it's the same as any genre, okay? Let's take magic, for example, okay? Harry Potter did not spend a ton of time explaining magic because Harry Potter is not about magic. Harry Potter spent a ton of time explaining Hogwarts and how the school worked and the dances and the grades and the classes, because that was really much more, we saw magic happen, but we really didn't learn where it came from and how it wears out and why do people have to practice waving their wands a certain way, but later on they can do spells without wands, because it wasn't about magic. On the other hand, if you read a Brandon Sanderson novel, which is very much about magic, you're going to get just so much detail that if you're not into that, you're going to start skimming. And I think that when you look at a steampunk novel, you explain what has to be explained and some parts you don't explain. So my first book was about a kid's building a giant mechanical dragon. Well, I didn't spend a ton of time evaluating, could a metal dragon really fly? But I did focus on what kind of engine were they going to use and how could they improve that. And when they first tried to use cloth for the wings and it ripped, what did they do about that? And those were details that made it feel very real. So is it integral to the story? If it is, then give me a lot more detail. If it's not, then you can back off a little bit and focus on the things that are important.
Yeah, one of the cool things about that is there's an awful lot in steampunk stories that you can build out of hand wavium. It's like, okay, this is happening just because that's the way it is.
How do you wind a mechanical prosthesis tight enough for somebody to be able to run for 2 hours? You don't.
Right.
But we build it out of hand wavium. Yeah, that's a good term.
And that's why, just like science fiction has a spectrum of very heavy science versus the more like space opera kind of science fiction, it sounds like steampunk also has a spectrum. Or would you say it's always a little less on the science side and more about the story and the experience?
I think by its nature, it's a little bit less rigorous on the science because that gives you all the cool aesthetics. Like, you probably not want to build stuff out of brass if aluminum is a lot lighter, but it looks cool.
Exactly. That's true. If you're going to make up a magical metal alloy, it's going to be reddish or gold.
Right. Yep.
That's true. And the whole Rube Goldberg machine,
Yes.
where you have this complicated thing because it's cool, even though it does a somewhat very simple or useless task. But it's cool.
It is cool. That's
So
exactly it. Yeah.
That's
I
what we're
actually
going
have a
for.
really good example of a little lighter steampunk. There's this, it's an opera that I discovered. I didn't think opera was cool until I was older and I discovered that rock opera was a thing.
You are sitting next to an actual
Yeah,
opera.
I have been educated. It's not as boring as I thought it was when I was a kid. I actually saw La Boheme and loved it. So
Good.
I have learned the error of my ways since. But I discovered this opera called The Dolls of New Albion.
Oh, yeah.
And yes, I'm not the only person who's heard of this.
Yep.
I drive my husband nuts listening to it in the car. But it's fascinating because it's set in this steampunk world where there's mad scientists and there's helium zeppelins everywhere and this guy rolls metal dice and has a fake eye or something. And then they throw in bringing back the dead and voodoo and all of these strange things that don't really quite feel, it makes it more fantastic than steampunk, I feel, normally is. And it just adds these elements of, fantasy and of the supernatural that make it more of a mixed genre. So
Cool.
If I can defend my two genres,
Please do.
opera and steampunk go very, very well.
they do.
Yeah, they're over the top, aren't they?
Yes, they
the
are.
full production value. Excellent. And the more we talk about the rules, the more we kind of like to push the rules and bend the rules, which is what punking is all about. So let's maybe talk a little bit more about any pitfalls, if you think that there are, especially concerning cliches and tropes that have been done quite a lot, and maybe we can move beyond them.
Okay, let me set the basis by saying that for me, behind every cliche, there was at one time a true artistic moment, right? And a trope is just a cliche that hasn't worn itself out yet. So if you look at the goggles, I see 4 pairs of goggles in the room right now, immediately identifiable as steampunk. There are writers that I've seen attempt to just put goggles on a character and call the story steampunk. That is a pitfall. Just setting something in the age of steam does not make it steampunk, it's gaslamp, right? It's got to be forward-looking from that point. It's got to be optimistic and looking into the future with that kind of optimism.
What about character tropes, heroes that we see a lot and maybe are done seeing? Or villains? Or is it still new enough that we're delighted in seeing the Han Solo with goggles?
Well, one of the things about the various tropes, whether it's the heroes and villains, is it's not necessarily that you are using a trope, because behind every story you can probably identify dozens of tropes. It's just how they are used and how they are twisted that makes them interesting, and the time that they turn into a cliche is when, yeah, we've tried that one before. And it's been done enough times that everybody's looking for something new. And so that's one of the things that you have to watch out for, is to not do those things that are the same old, same old. Now you've got the villain who is a villain because he is villainous and twists his mustache. And you think, well, yeah, that's a trope and it's been really overdone. But then you have something like Dr. Horrible's Sing-Along Blog. It can still be made new and fresh, but it's a lot harder.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think, again, I compare this to fantasy. If I'm writing a straight fantasy novel, I have to decide, am I taking the existing fantasy creatures? You know, if I'm going to have elves and unicorns and dwarves and, you know, all this kind of stuff, I can do that. It hasn't been, it's not to the point that you can't do that. But if I do that, then I've got to bring something new to the table. If all I write is, you know, Tolkien all over again or whatever, then at that point people say, wow, that's a trope, that's a cliche. On the other hand, if I take those creatures and characters and do something new with them, then that's great. Or I decide, hey, I'm going to go the other way, and I'm going to create my own creatures and magic and world building and stuff. And in that case, now I have a new problem, because what I have to do now is establish those creatures and rules and characters. And if I make a horse and call it some random word, but it's clearly just a horse, then I'm going to disappoint people there. And I think that's the same thing in steampunk, is what am I going to take that people know so I don't have to explain that? You know, I mean, I think readers would have been unhappy in my series if I hadn't had an airship in there at some point. You know, I mean, that's just, they want that. That's a cool thing. Or you know, a submarine. Those are things that we really, really like in steampunk. But at the same time, I had to throw in some new inventions and some new things. In fact, it was kind of funny when we did the last cover. They're like, okay, so you had a mechanical dragon on the first cover, you had an airship on the second cover, now we've got this really cool dragon on the third cover and the characters, but what is the steampunk vehicle that we're going to use? And I'm like, well, I do have a submarine, but it wouldn't really fit the way the cover's designed. You know, the sizing wouldn't work, and I have this and that. And so I started just basically searching for really unusual steampunk vehicles, you know, just looking at tons and tons of pictures until I saw something that looked kind of spider-like, and I was just like, wow, that's what I want. I want them to to all drive these vehicles that kind of look like spiders with these mechanical legs and implements, and you know, and that became a really important part of the story. So I think as long as you know why you're doing what you're doing, I think you're okay.
One of the really wonderful things about tropes is that they can very quickly set reader expectations.
Yes.
It's true.
Yeah.
I think my favorite trope that I've seen in most steampunk seems to have some form of mad scientist or mad inventor.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think I hope it's not a cliche yet. There's so many things that you can do with that character trope, especially for both a villain and a hero. Phil and Kaya Folio's webcomic Girl Genius that wound up becoming steampunk once they learned what it was. They have almost every single character in the book is some sort of mad genius. And they're all different and they're all unique, and that's a trope that's seems to be very common, especially in modern steampunk, where you have somebody who's just building crazy, ridiculous death rays out of whatever scraps happen to be around because it's fun and they want to see how far they can push it.
The Victorian era was, in real life, full of mad inventors.
Seriously.
And some really crazy mad villains who had their hands on technology. I don't want to harp. I was harping to somebody I was talking to earlier about Kaiser Wilhelm.
Yeah.
Mad genius with access to all sorts of killer technology who changed the world. Because he was a mad ruler, right, with access to all of that technology. So when you think about the steampunk the Victorian era, you have Edison, you have Tesla, you have all of these people from 1820 to 1900 doing these amazing things that are changing the world, and a lot of them are doing them alone in their laboratory. Right?
There's actually an archive with hundreds of patents for these ridiculous inventions, some of them from these famous people, and just nothing ever happened with them. They submitted the patent and it never got finished being built. And there's flying machines in there. People actually tried to patent wingsuits in the 1800s. And you can go and find some of this stuff and think like, well, okay, I like this. Some crazy guy tried to make this work. What if it actually succeeded? What if we had wingsuits? What if that was our primary method of transportation today?
Well, I want to back up just a second to something you said earlier about the comic that discovered that it was steampunk. It's one really interesting thing about steampunk as a genre is it grandfathered in a whole category of stories that really didn't have a home. Like we'd mentioned earlier, you got Jules Verne stories. All of those, you look at it and think, yeah, that's steampunk. It wasn't until a couple of decades ago, or even a lot more recently than that, because the name didn't exist. But it was really easy to identify several things that had all of those components, and it made it easier to define the genre because you already had this body of work that ran all the way back to the early 1900s.
Excellent.
One of my favorite stories that I've written as a novella was to take two great sea captains from the Victorian era who were separated in fiction by several decades, Captain Nemo and Captain Ahab, and put them together in a steampunk story. It was so much fun.
The punk part is there's just no bounds. It's so much
There are
fun you can
no
do.
boundaries.
So let's move into the craft side of it. We had several questions about how this is a visual and aesthetic genre. How do you capture that in the written word? And don't just say description, because yes, that's the right answer, but really, let's talk craft.
One of the things that really stands out is the sensory input. You have to cover everything because you'll have the smell of the coal burning to heat the water to make the steam. You've got the sounds of the gears and the whistles. You've got the visual aesthetics with the brass and copper and steel tanks and all the hoses and piping. So you have to really appeal to all of the senses together with it to make it really stand out. That's something you need to do with fiction in general, but with steampunk, you've got so many things to draw upon there.
I think one of the great tools, I mean, if your characters are already familiar with all of this technology and using it all the time, you often can't explain it in as great a detail. It has to kind of happen in the flow of the story. But on the other hand, if you have Harry, for example, in fantasy, again, I keep using that example, but Harry comes to Hogwarts and he doesn't know magic, great, now I can have him discover all this stuff. So if I have someone who's not a mechanic or an inventor who comes and sees this, the person who in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, gets captured and goes, wow, look at all this stuff. As an outsider, we can focus, we can pay attention to all of that. So that's one tool you can use.
That's great. Someone also asked about research, and a few things have been mentioned, but what would you add to that in researching if this is a new genre to you? You've shown up here today and been like, wow, steampunk's cool. How do I get started, and where do I look for research?
I actually made a list of that in preparation for this panel. There's steampunk literally everywhere. You look at the Ferris wheel, that was a steampunk invention. You look at anything that works with gears. Pocket watches are really a key thing lately in steampunk. It's everywhere. So you can go to webcomics like Girl Genius. You can watch. I found a documentary called Vintage Tomorrows. I didn't know that was a thing, that there was a steampunk documentary. There are tons and tons of novels, as you can see. I'm surrounded by novelists. But you can also go to music. Dolls of New Albion is fantastic. Or you can listen to Steam Powered Giraffe and Abney Park. And it helps give you more of that aesthetic of this is what steampunk feels like. This is what it sounds like. This is what it looks like. And so you can get it from literally everywhere. And there's the Steampunk Bible as well.
Or you can go to Disneyland and get on the submarine.
One thing you can do is just take a look at anything that you use commonly today and think, okay, if I had to power this thing with steam, how would it work? And my friend Jay over here wrote a story using the telegraph. It's that same era. It relies a little bit more on electricity instead of steam, but there's an awful lot of research that can go into that. And in our discussions about that, he said there were all kinds of things that he discovered, that you could even do things like rudimentary fax machines using telegraph. And so it's research like that that can just open your eyes to a whole world of things that you didn't know existed before.
And I will tell you, as a writer, when I'm doing that kind of research, I'm spending as much time researching as I'm writing. And I'm going down rabbit holes all the time. And it's just fascinating. And it's so much fun.
And I mean, there's several different things that you do. Like one of the things that I had to do is I had to take a look and say, okay, great, what technology was available at this time? And then that's what I can use and modify to create something else. Like we know that steampunk is pocket watches. Well, that's because there were no wristwatches at that time. Wristwatches weren't developed until later when you had pilots who were strapping their clock onto their wrist, and that's where those came from. So a lot of things like that where you have to take a look and say, like you said, okay, so I don't have fax machines. What did I have back then that I could take and then modify? So I do a lot of research with that. I mean, I had hydroponics because they were living in a city sealed inside of a mountain. So what technology from then could I use to have them have come up with hydroponics? And the other thing that you have to look at all the time is are the solutions to your problems steampunky? So again, in my series there were dragons, and eventually we have to discover where dragons came from. Well, we could create a portal to another world. That's not steampunky, okay? We could have dragon eggs have been lying around. That doesn't feel steampunky, On the other hand, if we had a cool lab with mad scientists who, at that point you're like, yes, we're back in steampunk again, So as you look at your solutions and your problems and what you're going to do, keep in mind again that you are writing steampunk, So that research is important too, I think.
Yeah, one important thing to remember is the wider you read, the easier it is. Because you can see the connections between weird things and say, hey, I can tie these together and use them as part of this story because, well, this thing might not be steampunk, but this might not be. You strap those things together and run them as a unit. Yeah, that might be the coolest thing ever.
I think something that really helps when, like, once you know what steampunk is and how to do it, you look at the references, what was available in the time period. If you want it to be set in America in 1820, look at what was around in America in 1820 and then make it unique, make it fantastical and sci-fi with what they had available.
Great. So let's take 2 minutes talking about the marketing side real quick, and then we'll have the last 5 minutes for any other questions you guys have. Do you feel like steampunk has a greater market in short fiction, long fiction, or are they equal?
In general, the longer fiction seems to do better from what I have seen. Others might have different experiences with that because it might just depend on which stories you get put together. If you get a really good anchor on a short story collection, yeah, it can also do pretty well. But yeah, Scott's got stuff in both short and long form, so maybe he's better answer.
I've got stuff in novel length, novella length, short story length, and flash fiction length, all published, all in the same universe. And the anchor, and this probably isn't generalizable, but the anchor is the universe that got set first.
Okay. For you as a writer?
For me as a writer.
Oh, great.
And it's just incredibly fertile. Once you get a universe established, there's all sorts of stories that just keep coming at you from that universe.
And you may find that your introduction, your step in, is being part of an anthology or short stories or e-zines or things like that. That may be what gets you in the door initially. It might not be because everybody has their own path there, but yeah, I don't think, I mean, there are great steampunk anthologies, there are great steampunk novellas, you know, I mean, so I don't think any one of them specifically is suited to steampunk more than another one.
Great. And has your experience been when you're trying to sell, if they have to specifically mention I'm looking for steampunk, or is saying I'm looking for science fiction a big enough umbrella?
I think you have to mention steampunk. I think in general, it was kind of a funny thing. My publisher wasn't planning on that, and you know, again, I don't want to make this about my books, but that's the experience that I had. So they were originally talking about, you know, this mechanical dragon, and then they started mentioning steampunk and dragons, and the first show that they went to, people came up and they're like, oh my gosh, it's like chocolate and peanut butter. I love dragons and I love steampunk. What a great combination. And suddenly they were like, oh, there's our hook, steampunk plus dragons. And so everything that they did, all their posters, you know, they had little cell phone holders and backpacks, and all of them had the logo and steampunk plus dragons. And that was all they needed to have people immediately go, yes, I'm interested. And I do think that steampunk, you don't need to win the whole world over. And there's a big chunk of the population that has no idea what steampunk is at all. But if you can get people who like steampunk to read your book, oh, you'll make a good living. You know, that's not, again, it's like, you think about Brandon Sanderson. If I went down my neighborhood and knocked on doors and said, how many of you know Brandon Sanderson? A lot of them would not. But the people who know Brandon Sanderson are like fanatics. And that's the thing with steampunk is steampunk fans, I mean, we are kind of fanatics, right? You know, and so we look for really cool stuff like that. And so I think that in and of itself is a pretty great marketing tool.
Great.
If I can make one more comment on that. If you are trying to break into steampunk publishing, it is really hard right now to sell full-length steampunk fiction. It's easy to sell steampunk short fiction. There are a lot of markets for steampunk short fiction. The big five won't touch full-length steampunk right now. Because again, they're rolling the dice and trying to predict what the public's going to want 2 years from now. And 4 years ago, they said steampunk was dead, and they were wrong then, and they're still wrong now.
And I will add that there are a lot of new books coming out from the Big Five that are middle grade steampunk. Not much more. Like YA, you don't see as much, and adult just hasn't taken off mainstream, which is like they don't know how to focus on a particular thing.
They don't know how to sell it.
All we need is one big blockbuster steampunk movie.
That's exactly what I have heard. Like I have had 24 people tell me if we could have one blockbuster steampunk movie, that would take off, that would do it. But kids love cool inventions and robots and technology and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I think that you are actually seeing a lot of, and some of it's hard steampunk, some of it's lighter, some of it's, I mean, you know, various versions of steampunk that are out there. But that idea of gears and cogs and machinery and stuff like that, kids really, really like that.
Kids are inherently optimistic.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And steampunk is inherently optimistic. The general public wants death, blood, gore, sex.
That's what the producers think, the general public, because I don't want. Okay, I saw your hand up. We covered it?
No, I just don't remember what it was.
Oh, no.
It was along the lines of whatever they were talking about.
Okay, good. Yes.
I was curious, so steampunk is about hope and potentially moving forward with basics in technology, is what I'm hearing. Can you use it also as a device, since it is about forward thinking and discovery and new ideas, to sort of like propagate, maybe in a subplot, other things? Like, could you have a steampunk story that was also about racial progression or women's rights?
Absolutely, yes.
That's actually a big issue in steampunk today, is the racial inequality and the class inequality of the time period, and how do they make steampunk equal? So that's actually that goes
And
together.
they've done a good job addressing gender, because
Yes.
gender inequality was a thing back then, but there's a lot of female protagonists in steampunk. And race is something that's still struggling, and I hope we see getting much better.
And just to reverse that really quickly, you can also go the other side. Like, you can have a primarily fantasy novel where they come into a world that is very heavy, steampunk, mechanical, you know, that kind of thing. So you can go both ways, but I love that question. That was great.
Yeah, for sure.
I was actually going to mention, like Victorian literature, there's like always a theme of like women going mad because their husbands are trying to control them. And so it made me think like that seems like it would be almost integral if you're doing like a historical steampunk.
Yeah, we see a lot of that.
Yeah.
Second row here.
So, this is probably a stupid question, but if you...
No stupid questions. We take them all.
Not allowed.
If it looks like steampunk, it acts like steampunk, but you replace half the steam with magic, it's no longer steampunk?
Correct.
Got it.
Although that's not a hard and fast rule.
And there's a lot of punking, right? There's cyberpunk and gear punk and
then become a
crystal
new
punk
subgenre.
Right.
So it then becomes fantastic.
So if you want a
fantasy
magic
steampunk.
punk, you go magic punk, girl.
And so you can add in these other aspects of it because we're already throwing physics out the window in most cases.
And here's the problem normally. What we've said is that steampunk generally is a subgenre of science fiction. When you add magic, magic becomes fantasy. So now what you're doing is basically doing a science fiction fantasy mashup, which there are a lot of those, but that's why it's not steampunk anymore, because now you've mashed up. And like I said again, I added dragons, but I didn't add magic. So once you come back and give it a steampunk origin for your dragons, then you could come back and say, okay, you know, that could still be steampunk.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, you can also take some of your magical elements and say, how could I do this with
Yes.
some contraption instead?
That's a very cool
Even if it's
thing.
a contraption that could not exist in the real world, that's still perfectly
It's still
fine.
steampunk.
In this one, the king of the fairies and the queen of the fairies are genius inventors.
Right.
Right? Magic disappears into technology.
Real quick, what steampunk book would you recommend? I would start with Scott Westerfeld's Leviathan.
Yes.
What?
I actually
My
have.
book.
Yeah, my stories are actually Lady of Devices by Shelley Adina. It's a series. That's the first book in the series. That's one of the first steampunk stories that I read, and it's
Captured Your Love. Okay, real quick.
Really is fun.
What would you say?
Agatha H. in the Airship City, the novelization of the Girl Genius comic.
Oh, great.
They actually go more into
Scott.
it.
I'm with you, Scott Westerfeld. The whole series that starts with
good.
Leviathan is just, it's my thing.
Yeah. It's awesome.
And I'll mention one. Rob Wells self-published a book that combines steampunk with King Arthur and I think like World War II or something. It was a really fun mashup, and that's a cool way to kind of see that. And he calls it Airships of something, but if you just search
Camelot.
Airships of Camelot, that's the one.
sense.
Yep.
Great. Thank you for being with us, everyone. Thank you.